Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video I'll be covering the first 4 bosses of the Vault of the Incarnates on Mythic. Difficulty, Eranog, Primal Council, Terros, and Sennarth. I'll go over things like the strategies we used, how we prepared for the different fights, and some other tips and tricks that will hopefully help you guys get these bosses down. Since these are the earlier bosses and they tend to be a bit less strategic and difficult than the later ones, I decided to put them all in a single video. But from here on out, all of the other Mythic raid guides I'll be putting out will be individual boss videos. So if that interests you, be sure you do subscribe to the channel and click on that notification bell so you don't miss a single video. Note that I'll be assuming that you do have some prior knowledge of the fights on normal and heroic difficulties for those mechanics. So I'm only going to be really looking at those Mythic mechanics and our general strategies. Instead, if you want to see the full videos of these kills, I'll post the VODs in the description as well for you to check out. Otherwise, let's get started here right off the bat with Eranog, and this boss is extremely similar to its heroic counterpart. The main difference here, in phase anyways, is that the boss will put a flame rift on the active tank as well. So we can fast forward a little bit here, see this first flame rift. It's going to go out on the several players, and then a big flame rift will go out on the active tank. There it is. And how we handled it is we just had the active tank plant on this outer ring here, and the other debuffed players just kind of filed in around them, overlapping. No real set positions, as long as it's somewhat close. You're kind of overlapping your circle a bit, but you're not in another person's circle. Dropped these adds off here. And then notice how the rest of the raid is positioned on the other side. We walk through the boss, and these mobs just all kind of naturally group up running through the boss itself. It makes them easy to AoE down. In terms of what the big ad actually does, he just has this kickable pyroblast here, and then he puts a magic debuff out onto 8 players. In a second here you'll see it, unless you kill him in this bloodlust, which we might. That leaping flames, which we did kill, it'll put out 8 magic dots out on your raid, which the big thing that we handle with is by using mass dispels from our priest. That'll clear a bunch of those debuffs off, and then you can individually clear the rest of them with single dispels, because obviously 8 dispels, if you're trying to single dispel all of those, it's going to take you some time before you're able to get rid of them because they are magic debuffs. So mass dispel works great here. If you have 2 priests, both mass dispelling will get rid of all of the debuffs very easily. And that's pretty much the only thing you need to worry about in this phase. So make sure you have some number of kicks available to kick that big ad. Make sure you're dispelling that dot. The only other change here is to the intermissions, which we'll fast forward a bit to see. And for this, basically just a single extra wave of ads that come from the center and move outwards. The big thing here is to put a skull on one, and notice how we did move slightly around these puddles here, and we didn't go to the closest one, which would have been this ad right here, because it would have cut off our space with these flame puddles. So make sure you pick one that has a ton of space, and make sure that your entire raid is hitting the same flame. It doesn't matter really if it's the inside flame or the outside flame. We just always did the inside flame because it was kind of right here for us to hit. So we just all focus this inside flame. Then once this inside flame actually dies, that's when we move and start killing the outside flame right after that coming. And make sure you're just not crossing this beam, of course. And the other thing is, don't be directly in the center of the room here when the boss finishes his cast, as it is a one-shot. So you see the range will immediately file out, melee, maybe get a few hits in, then leave, and no one gets instantly murdered by the boss, which is very, very good. Other than that, nothing really changes on this fight. Relatively easy first boss here. The one thing is, if you are having trouble killing those ads in time, you could do things like move Bloodlust or Pots to the intermission phase to make sure you can kill those ads before they run you over. Just be careful not to move too much off of the boss himself, because if that leads you to having an entire extra ad phase, well, that might actually make the fight a bit harder for you to deal with. That's it for Eranog though. So let's move up to the second boss of the raid here, Primal Council. Now, one thing, we did create a kick order for this boss on Mythic difficulty, much more important than normal heroic. We have 4 melee duration kicks on both Dathia and Cadros over here underneath my raid frames. Note that initially we also had a range DPS just kick in Dathia, just because she is kind of pretty far away for the first melee to get a kick on her. In terms of actually tanking these bosses, we do them in the center of the room here as much as possible, so we group them all up. The tank swap again is on Opal Fang still. Fire Path just has that frontal cleave, but the dot falls off very quickly before a second one happens. So the real thing you don't want to overlap is that crush debuff, so same kind of deal. Doesn't really matter who's tanking Dathia and Kadros. They don't really do much in terms of auto attack damage to the tank, so whoever can have them as long as they're not accidentally meleeing DPS occasionally. And the big thing of this fight here is managing your pillars. So the big thing is making sure that you have some sort of lifeline in melee for you to use for your lightning debuffs. Because of course those debuffs are now permanent on Mythic difficulty. So the only way to clear them is to touch a pillar. They're not going to expire, and you really don't want to be spreading those across your entire raid. So if you see here, we have these flame soaks going out, and this pillar should be safe there, and that is the closest pillar to melee. And so basically when these lightning debuffs go out here, I guess it's going to be a little bit of time before they do go out. Melee has 2 pillar options here nearby for them to use. And you can see our range is kind of in a couple different camps out in the ranged area. And for them, it's much easier to kind of spread because there's much less of them, much lower density. And they can be kind of fanned out around these pillars because of course these pillars are not line of sight. So the real problem area is the melee. So you want to make sure that you have at least 1, maybe 2 pillars nearby for the melee to kind of fan out here. And as you see, people have started to fan out a little bit because marks are coming. People are spreading a little bit. Here come the marks. The marks go out. The melee with the marks step out of melee. And notice how they can just immediately go to that pillar, right? The 2 marked melee who got it, they immediately went over to this pillar. Everyone else kind of shifted away or were already spread out. Here come the marks. They immediately just go, touch the pillar, done. Super clean. Didn't spread out to anybody at all. Everyone else is just kind of slowly, not panicking with the debuff, clearing when there's space. And that's the biggest thing here. Do not panic strafe with your conductive marks onto other people. You can hold that debuff for a little bit of time. It's not the biggest deal. You're not going to die. If you're really scared, pop a personal or something like that. But just having that mark on you is not the end of the world. Do not panic, run, and clear immediately. That's how you run into problems. Wait for there to be a clear lane. Slowly inch over, call if someone is blocking your way, for example, and then move and touch the pillar when it's safe to do so. The number one thing that's going to probably wipe people in this is just mass spreading that lightning debuff, right? Like, you don't want to do that. That is the number one thing you want to avoid at all costs. So make sure you're spread out. Make sure you have a pillar plan if the marks go on to you, and then if the mark doesn't go on to you, get the hell out of the way for everyone else to actually clear on those pillars. As I mentioned for boss positioning here, you want to try and stay in the middle of the room, but as the room kind of gets eaten up in the center here by those pillars, by the fire debuffs, you will kind of maybe slowly have to move down the room a little bit. That's fine, but you do really want to make sure that you have some pillars. Like right now would be a little rough for these marks because we don't have any nearby pillars. Right? That pillar got cleared, and so melee have to run a decent distance. Luckily, we have this pillar spawn here, so you see, pause, we saw the pillar spawn. Just wait, no need to try and run through all these people. Wait for those pillars to come up, it's fine, and then just tap and you're good. Like waiting for the lane to be open, and then moving, tapping the pillar, and you're good. Patience is key here. Do not panic with those lightning debuffs. Other than the lightning, the only minor difference here is that these flame puddles, as you might have seen already, do kind of dissipate as you soak them to cleanse your blizzard debuff. So to manage that, you just want to make sure that you're only touching these once to clear your debuff around like the 5 or 6 stack mark of that blizzard debuff. If you touch it then, you will not get frozen, and then you don't need to waste soaks of these puddles. Though to be fair, you do have plenty of extra soaks available to you for the most part. Just still manage your soaks. Don't over soak. It's just not necessary. That brings us then to Terros. Terros is basically just a full throughput check, both in terms of healing and damage. For Mythic, the main change here is to the Rock Blast soak initially. This will just do flat raid damage now that's reduced by the number of players soaking it. So you want to try and get as many people into this soak as possible every single time, just to make sure that you're taking as little damage from it as possible. For positioning, you want to make sure that the targeted player leaves some space. As you can see, I'll back up a little bit here. You don't want to be pushed up right against the boss because you want the tank to be able to freely move here to be able to hit the pillars, and also it gives melee DPS some space to actually dodge after the Rock Blast goes off. So don't be right up against the boss. Give a bit of a gap here, and it'll make your tank's life a lot easier. In terms of pillar placement, as you can see, they're all moving for us in a line as best they can on the left side of this soak facing the boss. You can also go 2 by 2. Like you see, it's not like a perfectly straight line, so you could like fit 2 pillars right next to each other here. It's not the end of the world because that beam is, as you saw, pretty big. You can hit everything relatively easy, and that was the strategy we used. We blew up every single pillar every time there were pillars. Or pillar players always went to the left side of that soak, so they lined up. We destroyed them in the very first soak. Note that this will get harder and harder hitting as the fight goes on because of the additional pillars per quadrant. So especially in the last couple quadrants of the fight, you want to make sure you have cooldowns covering those blasts. Things like Rally, things like Devo are very, very powerful for that. If like one pillar is off of something, in other words, you can always hit it with your next tank beam, but you really want to try and put this close together as possible. Another thing to notice, especially later on in the fight, when you do get those pillar debuffs, you're going to have a lot of them, right? And not necessarily all of you will fit inside the soak. That's okay. It's not the end of the world if one of your pillar debuffed players or 2 or 3 even aren't able to fit into the soak. The big thing you just want to avoid is, again, blocking off that front area so your tank can't stand at the front. And also, the priority here should always be to getting those pillars close together, not necessarily getting in the soak. Everyone else is going to be clustered in the soak anyways, as you can see here. So you really just want to try and make sure as best you can those pillars are going to be hittable by a single tank beam. Now, the actual mythic mechanic for this fight now is infused fallout. This is a dot that gets applied to every single player that will explode for rate damage whenever you touch another debuffed player, which clears your debuff then, and also spawns a pillar beneath your feet that deals a very high amount of damage if you actually stand within 4 yards of it. So you want to make sure you do avoid that. How we handle this is actually making sure we had an even number of players in melee and ranged. So for us, we had, I think, 12 to 14 players, one of the two in melee. You can see here's the dust going out. We have 12 players, I believe, here stacked up in melee here. All stacked up. This instantly clears 12 dusts, does a pulse of raid damage to everybody, and a ton of pillars spawn here. You will get one shot if you stand in this. The pillars just spawn up. That's how they look, like that, and then you can move back into your spot there. And meanwhile, after that goes off, people have been healed up. That's when the range start finding a buddy in the ranged area and clearing. That's why you want to have even numbers, because if you're an even stack, everybody will get cleared, then everybody can go and dodge the swirlies, and there'll be an even number of players out in the range to be able to clear as well. The people in this melee stack don't necessarily need to be melee, DPS, or tanks either. It's pretty heavy movement, so you don't really want to put a caster in there, but we had like resto druids in that stack, for example, just to make that melee number higher and have even numbers in both the melee and amps. The damage from that ability alone isn't necessarily lethal though, as it's basically just the combination of that damage combined with the other damage in phase. So what you see here is at the beginning of every quadrant, that dust also goes out outside of on pull. And so what we do is here we gate, we stay on top of this gate, and then the mythic mechanic's gonna come out in a couple seconds here. We insta cloak, or every 20 stacks of that debuff, instant clear that, and then we go into the phase, and that's fine because there is no other damage really going out right at the beginning of the phase. So insta clearing right on top of that lock gate right at the beginning of every phase is pretty helpful, and you're not too in danger. This soak does come out shortly after, as you saw, but it's not really in the world. You have enough time to top everyone up, and then you go back and repeat this soak as you did in the other phases. Now for melee, this fight is a bit of a dance here. So what you'll see here is, the soak comes out, melee, dodge the swirl, get away from the pillars, they go stack up over here. This beam comes out, it will join the stack, and so basically the stack is waiting to bait the slam. They bait the slam right here, then you can dodge either left or right. Obviously right is a bit dusty, so you tend to dodge left. You bait the puddles out here, the puddles drop, you go back to your spot for the dust, you stack, and then you move away from that, and then you go back to your stack. Meanwhile, the tank, as you can see, I'm out here right now. What the tank does is while the melee are doing this, as you saw before, go back here, do the soak, the active tank does the tank line, then he joins the melee stack for their little dance, right? We're baiting the slam, we're baiting the swirly puddles on the ground outside of this safe area. We're going back and we're clearing our mythic debuff. As soon as the mythic debuff is cleared, the active tank goes deep left here to bait this next tank line away from the rest of the raid so no one gets hit by it. Meanwhile, the tank who's not active during this time is just with the melee. So it's kind of just a bit of a dance here for melee, and you do that literally the entire fight. That is your dance, right? You're soaking, you're then going back and stacking up, you're baiting the slam, you're dodging out of the slam to bait puddles away from where the slam was, you're restacking underneath the slam to clear your mythic debuff, you're avoiding that pillar that spawns from clearing your mythic debuff, and then you're regrouping again in that same spot, and then you do that the entire phase, and eventually you'll lock gate out to the next quadrant. Once you get to the end of this fight, you are able to extend the enrage a little bit here, just by gating into the puddles from the first quadrant that you started in. Let's see if I can find it here. You can also walk in as well, it doesn't really matter, just depending on your position. But basically, if you stand in this annihilation, you will die. If you stand here, you just take heavy ticking damage. So you stay here as long as you can, then you either gate or step into this area, and that's where you can stack up and you can chain raid cooldown. So what we'd have first, barrier, and then we chain the barrier into darkness, and I think Spear Link may happen at some point as well, but basically just chaining those stacked ground effect powerful CDs to help live through this ramping damage while you're also in the puddles to maybe get that last little bit of health percent off the boss to get that kill. But that is Terros. It's basically, like I mentioned, just a raw throughput check from both a damage and healing perspective, and that leaves us with the final of the first 4 bosses, Sennarth, which is where the bosses do start to get a little bit more involved. Terros is definitely a step up from the first 2, but like I mentioned, it's just a throughput check, right? There's not a ton of complicated strategy or anything else like that there. There's a lot more on Sennarth to keep track of. To start off with, the main new thing you have to avoid throughout this entire fight are the Gusting Rime tornadoes, both on the platforms themselves and the ramp as well, which will deal a chunk of damage to you and also do a pretty significant knockback as well, which can be scary, especially if you're sliding on ice. So be careful of those, and also those ramps can be pretty scary as well, because on Mythic they are now completely covered with ice. Also, in terms of how we keep these platforms clean, we kind of divide them into 3 areas here. You've got like the right area of the platform here, the middle area back here, and then the left side of the platform here. In terms of when you go to those parts of the platform, you have like this right area for when the ad is spawned, or before it's spawned rather. The middle part, which is this area, is while you're killing that ad and shortly after you've defeated it. And then you have the left side of this platform for after the ad is dead and just before you move up towards the last platform. This first phase is a bit shortened, so you didn't really see us use much of the right side of the platform here. We mostly use like the middle and the left. For the higher platform phases, we do use that entire platform because this ice is baited around players, as are these tornadoes, so we don't want those leading us if we can help it. Sticky webbings as well, we don't want it cluttering up the middle of this platform. You see we have like a bunch of it over here, and I think like back here as well. These debuff now also lasts a whole minute and web wraps you at 8 stacks, so you don't really want to use this to stop the grip from the Gossamer Burst to prevent you from being pulled off. Instead, standard speed boosts, leaps, dashes, anything like that. And even if you have 0 speed boost whatsoever, you can actually see us here. You can actually just run right to the back of the platform, and as long as you're just W keying against this pull-in, you are just fine. See the priest there, like the druid there, you just W key against it. You don't actually need any speed boost, and particularly for these like in phase grips that are relatively easy, you have a lot of space, there's no ice blocking you because you've positioned well. It's something you want to do. You kind of want to greed your leaps and your bigger speed boosts for some of the scarier overlaps. Unless, of course, you're a spec that just has them for every single overlap, then send them for sure. But if you aren't able to have them for every overlap, then you definitely want to save them for the more dangerous ones that happen as you're moving up near the top of the ramp. Ad management is also more important in Mythic, and we can take a look at that up the hill here a little bit. So basically for these ads, they kind of run around causing chaos a little bit. And so what we did is whenever there was an inactive tank, they would try and round up these ads as best they could, going out here, taking them off, because otherwise they're just kind of out hitting the boomkins often or the healers, one of the two, and that's something you don't really want. So whenever we had the opportunity to go and eat some or taunt them off and bring them in, we did. When the big ad came out, we had one tank just taunt them in and stack them directly under the boss here for cleave and point them away to the outside for this breath. Otherwise, this breath would just spew frost along the whole platform. Now instead, it puts it in a puddle kind of around the arachnid itself. And these guys are a pretty high kill priority here because of their ramping frost damage. Every time that chilling aura cast goes off, you really do feel it, and it ramps up, of course, with every third, fourth, fifth stack even, and ideally you do kill it either just around that fifth, preferably just before it, so you don't eat a big tick here. That tick that knocked us down was the fourth tick of this chilling aura, so you do want to make sure you have damage for those adds. And in these upper platform phases, hard focusing those arachnids. In the lower phase, it's not a big deal because you have lust rolling and you can just kind of cleave off the boss and kill those adds in time just fine. But that fifth stack is what you're trying to avoid at all costs. And let's talk about moving up the ramp a little bit, because this is likely where you're going to lose a lot of people pretty often. First, the lock gate. Note that this gate is going to go pushed further and further up each hill, just a little bit further, not a ton further. Okay, the first one we had it at the bottom. This one's like a little bit more up, and the next one's going to be a little bit more up, because as you can see, we're starting to get towards when we want a gate, and I'm still on gate cooldown. So the gate cooldown isn't quite long enough for these phases, so to get around that, we just move the gate up a little bit higher, so you have to walk a little bit to get to the gate, so you don't have any wasted time just waiting, sitting at the bottom for your gate to come off cooldown. The important thing here is to try and make sure that the end of your gate isn't directly in the path of a tornado. Going through a tornado is fine, it won't knock you, but see here, like no tornadoes. Good, that's exactly what we want. We gate through, and the problem would be is if you gated through and then just kept W king and walked right in this tornado, right? So you want to gate through, see where you are. Big thing is the players using the gate, because these tornadoes obviously move, you need to make sure the gate is safe before you take it. If there's a tornado right at it, wait a few seconds for that tornado to pad away, then take the gate. In terms of when you're taking that gate, something to note here is that not everyone immediately takes the gate. What we're waiting for is this web debuff here. So several players are about to get picked with webs. There it goes. Several players got picked. Everyone else who didn't get picked goes up, and see the web players, they stay down here. Everyone else leaves, takes the gate, and goes up the hill. We don't want those webs leading us on the gate up at the bottom, the very entrance of this platform, right? We want to leave those webs down on the previous platform, so those players stay, everyone else leaves. For tanks also, you saw I lagged behind a little bit there as well. The active tank always kind of wants to stay within this boss's hitbox along this ramp even, so they want to stay a little bit, then take the gate so they're still in the boss's hitbox. Otherwise, those web blasts will start either hitting your a coat tank, which can possibly refresh them, which is very bad, or sometimes even if your coat tank is also way out of range, hit random melee DPS, which of course is something you definitely want to avoid. So the job of the tank who's tanking the boss during those ramps is to make sure that they are close enough to that boss to still be the target of those web blasts. All three of these lower platforms are relatively the same though, so you're basically just doing the same thing for all three of these platforms, right? Starting on the right side, then middle, then left to bait all these ice puddles, the webs, and the tornadoes, so you have space to move up clearly. And then once you actually get to the top here, let's fast forward. The boss will jump down here. We kick near the end of this cast just to milk a couple extra seconds. And basically what we've done in this phase is we've kind of assigned sides a bit, where a bunch of melee are assigned sides and ranged are assigned sides here at the edge of the platform for the actual drop of those plume puddles on the ground. For the first spawn here, we made everyone in the entire raid soak their own plume. Just make sure you do not get knocked off here, as you can see. So the Chung Blast goes out. Everyone's kind of spread onto their sides. Everyone has space. Debuffs go out. Plumes spawn beneath them. And then we soak our plumes there. Careful not to get knocked off. And then we go back into your spots here. After this first spawn of the plumes, only the tanky melee and the tanks themselves in front of the boss are soaking their own puddles. Everyone else is kind of spreading out towards the edges of the platform. As you can see, here we go. They'll spread out towards the edges of the platform here and just drop it off out of the way so that the center line is still clear. That's the number one thing here. Center line wants to be clear. If you're tanky enough, you can just go and soak yours here. But the big thing here is making sure that we have this line straight from the boss, because there is a knockback in this phase, right? Both on the web here and then the big Gossamer pushback as well. And you don't want to be knocked into one of these plumes. Otherwise, pretty high chance you get sent off the platform. So keeping this lane in the center clear is very important, and something we've done also on these later waves, like the third plus wave. of these debuffs is you can use things like a Rogue Cloak and things like Hunter Turtle to clear a bunch of these as well, and just make sure you have more than enough space so you don't get pushed into them. In terms of the tank debuff here, so the tank and one other person, so in this case me and Dogland, we're getting wrapped in web. So what we do is we stack right here, we get pushed back, and we'll be both wrapped in that web. And how we handle this is, one, ad management is important, of course, because these spiderlings can break them out, but we had access to 2 paladins. So what we did for these 2 waves is we bopped off the tank. You can see you can bop the tank here. I'm now free, and what I can do with these spiderlings is I can then taunt one of these spiderlings over to the other player, and we can kill it on top of the web. Notice we almost didn't make it there. Managing these ads is extremely important in this phase, particularly if you don't have access to bops. You will need to break out your tank ASAP, and that's where things like Mass Entanglement from Druids or Ox Statue from Monks can be very useful for grouping up those ads, and then you can just kind of have maybe one non-tank player that has access to a taunt ability, either tap them out of the root and then taunt the ad into the stack of the DPSer and the tank, or just taunt it if it's just on a statue. The big thing here is you only want to do one ad underneath the tank and the DPSer, because that explosion on the ground puts a nasty debuff on players now for 30 seconds on Mythic difficulty, which basically means if you get hit by a second one in that 30 seconds, you get one shot if you're not a tank player. So if you ever cleanse someone with 2 swirlies, they're likely dead if they're not the tank. So that way is definitely a little bit harder. That's why we opted to use the bops, because we had them. Makes life a little bit easier. Otherwise, you would need to give some responsibility to one other player to make sure they're taunting ads on top of the web wrapped tank specifically, and DPS player if they weren't stacked up as well. But ideally, those guys are stacked up also. We also found it useful to make sure that we had just one DPS focused on killing a few of these spiderlings, especially on the waves of spiderlings we knew we would need to use to clear people out, just so it was much less likely that we ever had a double stack swirly underneath players that would involve deaths. In terms of raid CD usage on this fight, the few dangerous overlaps usually involve this Chilling Blast here. Pretty much anytime this happens in the last phase with that ramping damage, of course, it's spooky. The first one in this phase, you don't need much, but the second and third, I would recommend having something, and hopefully you kill the boss before the fourth. That's kind of your goal. But particularly when this happens earlier on in the boss fight, you can probably see it here. When this happens when the Frostbite Arachnid is still up, this is dangerous. This is a pretty dangerous overlap here. Because of course that pulsing frost damage, very scary, combined with that raid wide ticking damage. And the other time it's pretty scary is when it happens here on the ramp, because your raid is pretty spread out. Depending on your movement, you might not be in range of some of the healers. So this is the other scary movement where you'd want to have CDs, and see we have rally running for that one in particular, because this second ramp also is the one that has a slightly worse overlap than the other ones, in my opinion. This is also not a bad spot to use things like Health Pot, Healthstone, Personals as well, because that Chilling Blast combined with other things, that's what's going to kill you on this fight, aside from being yoinked off or, hitting a tornado or something like that. So the damage mitigation portion, that's what you should be using. But there we have it, guys, my walkthrough of the first 4 bosses of Vault of the Incarnates on Mythic difficulty. Hopefully this does help you guys out, and if it did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like it. As I mentioned, I'll be putting out individual guide videos for the remaining Mythic bosses as I get them down. And if you're interested in dungeon content, I'll be posting +20 walkthroughs as well very soon, with a ton of dungeon specific tips and tricks that will hopefully help you get those dungeons down on a +20 as well. If you have any questions about any of these bosses or the raid or tanking or whatever it is, feel free to drop those down in the comments below, or come check out my Twitch channel and ask me there over at Tactics, and I'll do my best to help you out. Otherwise, thanks everyone so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.